1945, so immediately after World War II. And the law turned 75 years old this past April, and we're planning a big celebration. We had a celebration planned in person, but we're planning a big virtual celebration now for this coming April. And DCR is the state agency that is charged with enforcing the law against discrimination, and really the state agency that is charged with focusing on civil rights all day, every day, day in and day out. And so as I mentioned, I'm going to briefly go through some information about the rise in bias incidents, specifically in New Jersey. In 2019, as you can see, there were 994 total reported bias incidents in the state of New Jersey. A bias incident is something that is reported to law enforcement as having occurred because of the victim's race, religion, national origin, or ethnicity, gender identity or expression, disability, sexual orientation. This was a huge increase. It was a 75% increase over the number of bias incidents in 2018, the largest number of bias incidents that New Jersey ever recorded since New Jersey began recording this data more than 25 years ago. And it is really alarming, especially with regard to the number of bias incidents that students and young adults were involved in, and that's something that I will get to shortly. So this just shows since the state began keeping track of bias incidents since 1995, this was the highest number in any year, and it was a huge jump between 2018 and 2019, and a huge jump every year since 2015. As is the case in every other year since 2006, in 2019, anti-Black racism was the reported motivation for the most number of reported bias incidents, 30% of all bias incidents, and also consistent with historical trends, anti-Jewish bias was the reported motivation for 28% of all bias incidents reported in 2019. This is what I mentioned in terms of the number of bias incidents that students and young adults were involved in. And this is something that is extremely concerning because this is what is going to impact what happens to these numbers going forward. So by age, the number of bias offenders who were 17 and under was 46% in 2019. Altogether, 57% of offenders who were known were ages 25 or younger, and the victim by age, a total of 48% of victims were 25 or younger, and 36% were 17 or younger. A full 25% of reported bias incidents in 2019 occurred in K through 12 elementary schools. And so that brings me to one of the Division on Civil Rights' biggest projects over the course of the past year. This data was alarming in 2019, but the trends were there in 2018 as well. And after the Division on Civil Rights issued a bias incident report in 2018,
yes, Dr. Park, how are you?
That exposed these trends, the governor, the lieutenant governor actually signed an executive order creating New Jersey's interagency task force to combat youth bias. And it was a task force comprised of 8 different government agencies, from the Department of Education, Department of Children and Families, New Jersey State Police, the Office of the Secretary of Higher Education, Homeland Security and Preparedness, a huge number of state agencies that were supposed to meet, and the mandate for the task force was to study the root causes of youth bias and then make recommendations for what the state should be doing differently to address youth bias. And so the task force actually did a huge amount of community outreach over the course, as I said, of almost a year. Last fall, we held 5 community listening sessions across the state. We held listening sessions in Hackensack and New Brunswick and Trenton and Bridgeton, all over the state. And we were able to hear from hundreds of New Jersey residents and a really large number of students in schools who came and shared their honest and difficult and raw experiences of having been subjected to bias and stereotyping and prejudice in their schools. And we were able to meet with a huge number of community stakeholders and nonprofit organizations that engage in this work. And altogether, we put together it's a 103-page report. So if you're looking for some light reading, I'm not sure that I would recommend it, but there is an executive summary that boils everything down. And there are 27 different recommendations from the task force on how New Jersey should be doing things differently when it comes to bias and prejudice and stereotyping. So one of the really important parts of the report came from what I mentioned was a discussion and really a deep dive into the root causes of youth bias. And one of the insights of the task force, and this was something that was repeated again and again by people who attended our listening sessions across the state last fall, was that bias is learned. Children learn bias from everywhere around them, starting at an incredibly young age.
Right.
And particularly when it comes to being in schools, children take note of whose stories and histories are taught and valued in the curriculum and whose are not, whose misbehavior is excused and whose is policed, and whose academic achievement is supported and expected, and whose is not. And one of the things that the report pointed out is that in New Jersey, although more than half of students are non-white, more than 3/4 of public school districts have teaching and professional staffs that are at least 85% white. And even though students of all races misbehave at similar rates, Black students are 3.1 times more likely to be suspended than white students. Similarly, students are placed in AP and IB honors courses at racially disparate rates, with white students 2.5 times as likely as Black students to be placed into AP courses. So the report, as I said, not only discussed the root causes of where do children learn bias and what causes them to choose to act on bias. In terms of what causes children to act on bias, there were a number of things discussed in the report, basically all boiling down to children decide to act on bias if they think it's socially acceptable to do so, and what goes into them thinking that it is socially acceptable to do so can be political rhetoric, it can be things that they're reading on social media, it can be impacted by hate group recruitment, all of which have become really exacerbated in recent years. So the report, after engaging, as I said, in this really deep discussion of the root causes of how students learn bias from the systems and institutions that make up our entire country. And one of the things that people who attended our listening sessions pointed out is, of course, bias and prejudice are not new in the United States. This year marks the 401st year since enslavers brought Africans to the United States, and plunder of people of color certainly did not end with emancipation. Many of the institutions that shape our country and our state have a history of oppressing people based on race, based on religion, based on gender, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and disability. And so this is not that all of a sudden New Jersey is just realizing in 2020 that this is a problem. This was more the state making a profound commitment to try to do everything in its power to address that problem by first figuring out the scope of the problem and then having these recommendations in hand. So as I said, the task force ended up making 27 recommendations in areas of education, enforcement, and engagement. The two recommendations that the task force report called the most important were requiring comprehensive anti-bias education in public schools and developing the required curricular supports and requiring anti-bias training for educators and school employees. And I actually just hosted earlier today a roundtable discussion with community leaders across the state. So we had the regional director of the ADL participating, the president of the NAACP's Next Gen Leadership Group participating, the acting deputy director of Garden State Equality, and a teacher from Hackensack High School who brought a number of his students to our listening session in Hackensack, and who then allowed us to come and observe his class. And his students provided some of the most incredible insights that are all quoted directly in the report. So we had this roundtable discussion, as I said earlier today, for advocates to really be able to talk about, okay, what in this report works, what doesn't work, where should the report have gone farther, where was it perhaps not discussing an issue that it should have, and one of the things that everyone discussed is just how important comprehensive anti-bias education for all children is, because there are existing curricular requirements. For example, around the Amistad education requirement, there's a requirement to teach about the Holocaust. There's a new requirement from last year to teach about the contributions of LGBTQ, of the LGBTQ plus community and people with disabilities. And all of those are incredibly important. But one of the things that people raise to the task force repeatedly is that they're sometimes seen as another check the box requirement, and that they're not integrated in a holistic way that really recognizes the intersectionality of all of these issues and recognizes the history of bias and prejudice when it comes to so many institutions in our country. So the anti-bias education recommendation is a really important one, as is anti-bias education for teachers, so that they are able to effectively discuss these issues with their students. And then there are, as you can see, many other recommendations, from encouraging school districts to hire chief equity officers, to requiring anti-bias policies in colleges and universities, to strengthening the state's hate crimes law, to launching a statewide campaign to stand up to hate in New Jersey, which we are about to launch in a few weeks, to creating resource guides for parents and schools about a whole variety of different issues. And so the governor actually 2 weeks ago signed an executive order requiring that all of the recommendations that could be implemented by state agencies without legislation be implemented. And then a number of the recommendations, of course, will require legislation, and we look forward to working towards implementation of all of them. So one of the things that Lisa said that it might also be productive for me to discuss is, what can people do on an individual level? So this is obviously a huge issue in our society right now. You might feel helpless or not sure exactly how you can contribute. What can people do on an individual level? So I wanted to talk about that for a couple of minutes. Again, being mindful, Lisa, that if there are comments in the chat, please let me know, okay? So a few things. One, become aware of your unconscious biases. This is something that is discussed more now than it used to be, but basically, it is a natural part of our brains in that we are exposed to, I believe it's 11 million pieces of information per second, but you can actually only consciously process 40 pieces of information per second. Even that seems like a ton to me. I don't think my brain is processing 40 pieces of information per second. So most of the processing in our brains is happening unconsciously, which means our brains are relying on unconscious associations and using them as mental shortcuts so that we don't have to process all stimuli as if it is new in every single moment. But the problem with some of those shortcuts is that they might be inaccurate and they can lead to harm. And so there has been research which research has been done to show that applicants with quote unquote white sounding names got 50% more callbacks than Africans with quote black sounding names, even with identical resumes. US doctors have been found to recommend less pain medication for Black or Latinx patients than for white patients who are presenting with the same injury. Instituting blind auditions for women in the 1970s when it came to joining philharmonics across the country, especially when they added carpet so that the judges could not hear the clacking sound of high heels, ended up leading to 50% more callbacks for female musicians into national philharmonics. And women went from being 5% of members of these top 5 symphony orchestras to 25% in a period of a few years, only by putting a screen and carpet between the people who were making the decisions and the people who were auditioning for these spots. Those are just a few examples of how your brain can make unconscious associations without you realizing it. Certainly, had someone asked the people who were participating in the symphony orchestra auditions in the 1970s if they were discriminating against women intentionally, they would have said no. And if someone had asked them if a woman could be in the orchestra, they probably would have said yes. But their brains were just more likely to associate a man with someone who belonged in the orchestra than a woman. So I really encourage everyone to take an implicit bias test. Project Implicit from Harvard has tests that are on every single topic from race, gender, disability, weight, national origin, religion. And it's really important to learn about your unconscious biases, because then you can make a conscious effort to disrupt them, which means a conscious effort to think for a long enough time before you act that you can question your initial assumption and try to take biases into account, and then try to act only according to your conscious values and goals, not any unconscious assumptions. In terms of other things, systemic racism and white privilege is not a topic that enough white people oftentimes feel comfortable talking about, but we will never be able to address it if we cannot discuss it. And so it is something really important to have these conversations, do research, read books, listen to podcasts, watch movies, and really try to understand systemic racism and, as I said, your own unconscious biases in a way that you might not otherwise be aware of. And something else to really always keep in mind is be mindful that you might, of any defense mechanism that you might have if confronted or called out, be willing to challenge your immediate response, be open and willing to listen and consider a new perspective, even if it makes you uncomfortable. Other really important things that we can all be doing right now: center Black voices in conversations and movements, create space for diverse viewpoints, do not accept symbols of progress as the end of the work, evaluate the organizations and the places of business that you're involved with to see how things like wage disparities, decisions on promotions, how all of those things can be made in a, decisions can be made in a way that is equitable. And then something that's really important that I think that this group has done a pretty great job of already, from what Lisa has told me, is personal interactions. Dr. Martin Luther King said that people fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. And this is really hard because of COVID, but the best way to break down stereotypes is by dealing with people as individuals and not as members of groups. So any way that you are able to interact with someone who you might not otherwise interact with in your everyday life is a good thing. It also requires having repeated and honest conversations with family and friends that involve calling out racist comments whenever you hear them, including microaggressions. This can mean difficult conversations with relatives, coworkers, close friends, but it's really important to have those conversations and then to take actionable steps beyond the conversations, especially in organizations and institutions with which we are intimately involved, including our workplaces. If you personally have been a victim of bias or discrimination, or if you know someone who has, they can contact the Division on Civil Rights. The law against discrimination prohibits discrimination and bias-based harassment based on a whole host of protected categories in employment, housing, and places of public accommodation. Places of public accommodation are basically any entity or institution or building open to the public, including government agencies, restaurants, theaters, hotels, doctors' offices, hospitals, etc. And the Division on Civil Rights investigates complaints of discrimination and bias-based harassment in addition to these larger proactive projects like this Youth Bias Task Force report. And as I mentioned, the 27 recommendations, we also have a statutory obligation to investigate any time that anyone files an individual complaint with us. And our investigation is different from an investigation into a hate crime because in a case of a hate crime, a criminal investigation focuses on the individual perpetrator and whether or not they committed a crime. A DCR investigation focuses on, if it's an example of harassment, whether the harassment rose to the level of a hostile environment and whether the employer or housing provider or place of public accommodation did what was required to stop it. This is some information about DCR's investigation process in terms of what is required to file a complaint with DCR, and I'm happy to discuss that more if people have questions. But then if DCR does find a violation of the law against discrimination, we can require equitable relief like new anti-discrimination or anti-harassment policies, anti-bias training, monitoring or reporting to DCR over a period of years, other creative ways to prevent discrimination or harassment in the future. And then we can also award money damages to the victim and collect statutory penalties to ensure that the issue does not happen again. I'm going to stop my screen share now so that I have time to answer questions. And I'm sorry that I was not able to see the chat while I was sharing my screen. I can see it now, and I'm going to take a minute to read it. I see from...
Rachel, I could read the first question to you.
Awesome.
Okay, and if anyone has any questions, just keep them coming in the chat. Donovan is one of the members of the Board of Education, and he writes, the more we interact with people of diverse background, the less we have implicit bias. However, New Jersey is fourth most racially and ethnically diverse state in New Jersey, but the schools are the most segregated. Apartheid schools are those which have 0 to 1% white students. 46% of Blacks and Hispanic students attend apartheid or intensely segregated schools in New Jersey. New Jersey schools are more segregated than their community. What are the task force recommendations to address this?
Thank you so much, Donovan. I 100% agree that the more that we interact with people of diverse backgrounds, the less we at least will act on our unconscious biases, even if we might continue to have them even without realizing it. And you are correct that based on data, New Jersey schools are extremely racially segregated. The task force report discusses a number of things related to segregation within schools. So for example, when it comes to placement in different courses, placement both in special education courses and then placement within AP and advanced courses, there is a lot of data that shows that there are large racial disparities in placements, even within a school. When it comes to the larger issue of segregated public schools, a lot of it is related to segregated housing, and DCR separately, not as a part of the task force, has done a huge amount of work to address racial steering and other practices that lead to segregation in housing. So DCR, for example, about a month and a half ago, announced an initiative that was called Project Home that was aiming to address housing providers that do not want to accept Section 8 or other government rental assistance. Sometimes that is so that certain people that they do not want moving to a particular neighborhood are not able to move there. That is illegal under the law against discrimination. And the action that we announced included not only individual enforcement actions, but also a huge amount of training for real estate providers, for housing providers, for members of the New Jersey Apartments Association when it comes to the law against discrimination's requirements, both in terms of source of lawful income, which means accepting Section 8 or COVID-19 relief vouchers or other state rental assistance, but then also when it comes to racial steering. And segregation, residential segregation can be directly tied to the federal government's housing policies that were in effect in the 1930s, where the word redlining came from actual red lines around certain neighborhoods where the federal government's mortgage authority would not back certain loans, where they would not allow Black people to move into certain neighborhoods. And that has had a huge and extremely long-term consequences that we are still feeling today.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Rachel?
Would I be able to ask a question out loud? Or please speak for a moment, maybe just make a comment. Hi, my name is Vanessa. I'm actually not an Englewood resident.
Can you ask her to unmute herself? I just muted everyone just so that we could hear her better.
Oh, okay.
Gotcha.
Vanessa, can you
I'm unmuted.
Okay, perfect.
Hi. So I just wanted to say thank you all for arranging this. This is amazing. My name's Vanessa. I'm actually a River Edge resident, but I follow We Live in Englewood on the Facebook page because my family enjoys spending time in your town. We love it there. Was very sad to hear about, what's been going on over the past weekend. And they had actually posted that you were having this event, which is why I decided to join and just find out what we're all going to discuss. And you guys were spot on, actually, with what we're trying to enact here in our town, which is an anti-racist curriculum for our kids. The information that you just provided is invaluable. Is there any way that this PowerPoint will be available publicly? We may even call you in, Rachel, if you have time to speak with our residents here, because we've been arranging virtual teach-ins to try to, make everybody a bit more comfortable talking about this really important topic and, getting our kids educated about how to interact with, the world outside of our little towns, and try to, curb this rise in, an unfortunate rise in racism. I just hate to even say it, biased behavior. So yeah, I guess my biggest question is, will this information be made public?
So Vanessa, the Youth Bias Task Force report, which actually discusses in detail the importance of anti-racist education in K through 12 schools, has been made public. It is, as I said, 103 pages. So I understand if you do not read the whole thing, but there is a whole section. There's a whole section on the importance of anti-racist education, and specifically on, as I mentioned, although there are existing curriculum requirements for the whole state around teaching about the Holocaust, around teaching about the contributions of LGBTQ people, around the Amistad curriculum. One of the things that the task force heard consistently at our listening sessions and from educators and from experts around the state is that all of those requirements are not being comprehensively integrated into a coherent whole that is helping students, as I said, to understand the intersectionality of all of these issues and helping students to really look at the world through this lens of anti-racist and anti-bias education. So we think that that is incredibly important. I'm very glad to hear that you are trying to make it happen in your town. And I would love for you to be able to look at the report and then of course get in touch if you have any questions.
Thank you so much.
We have, I'm gonna, Charlotte and then Colette. Charlotte, you first.
Rachel, I know you're familiar with the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. I found out from my family in Maplewood that the kids who were in 9th grade actually had an opportunity to do a Zoom with her the other day. And for those who don't know and haven't read Cast, you have to right now because you have to, because it addresses both the implicit bias and the links between Indigenous massacre, Nazi massacre, Black massacre, and she puts it all in one. How can you recommend that that kind of opportunity gets into the statewide initiatives that you're doing?
So I think you are 100% right that there are a lot of really important books to be reading right now. Other ones that I had on my list are The Warmth of Other Suns, also by Isabel.
It's the same author.
Oh.
Yeah, it's Isabel Wilkerson.
Yes, also by Isabel Wilkerson. The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum. Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. There's really a huge number of books, and I was able to hear Professor Ibram Kendi yesterday actually on a Zoom, and he was also really fantastic. I think that one of the benefits to how we are living right now, perhaps one of the few benefits, is that we are able to connect virtually with people who we might have never been able to connect to in person. And so this is an incredible time for a school year that is teaching virtually to take the opportunity to bring in someone like Isabel Wilkerson, bring in someone like Ibram Kendi, bring in someone who might not live in New Jersey and who they might not be able to bring in person, but who they can bring in on Zoom to talk to students, because it really can be an incredibly meaningful conversation.
Thank you. And Colette, you had a question?
Hi, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. It was, you got to see my notes. I got to go back. I was just writing like so much. My name is Colette Thompson. I'm a member of the NAACP, where I'm the president of the Youth and College Division. So when I saw that Lisa posted this, I had to come. And it was very informative for me. I just had a meeting with the kids tonight, actually right before I came on with you. We had just finished with them, and they're going through a lot. The youth of Englewood, the Black Student Union of Englewood, they're going through it right now with all the news and the stuff that's going on in the community and the world and everything. And they have a lot of questions. And you answered a lot of them for me tonight. with your presentation, you know, and when I go back to them, I'm gonna, you know, talk to them about a lot of things, but as a community, what's happening right now, it's just devastating. And this forum is awesome. It's awesome. And I wish I would have had one of them come on here with me tonight and witness this, because it was good for me. And I appreciate you. And I thank you for your presentation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colette. I would be very grateful if you were able to share sections of the report with the students, and then
Absolutely.
maybe we could set up a way where they could give us virtual feedback, because one of the most important things for the task force, as I mentioned, was really being able to connect with individual students. And so there was a huge group of students from Hackensack High School who attended one of our listening sessions. Someone from my office then went and sat in their race and representation class and was able to talk to a number of the students afterwards. Someone else from DCR was able to attend a national, this was pre-COVID, but there was an in-person gathering, I think in January, of different representatives from schools across the state. And someone from my office was able to attend and talk to really a large number of students there. And the feedback that we received from students, as I said, was so honest and insightful and thoughtful, but also difficult and raw and hard to hear, because I think a lot of people would like to believe that this type of thing is not happening anymore, and it definitely is. And so if you were willing to share parts of the report, there are direct quotes from students about their experiences, and then share your feedback, we would be very grateful for that.
I know this might not be the place, but would I be able to, through Lisa, maybe you could speak where you did tonight with my organization, with the NAACP as well as BSU? Would you be willing to do that?
Yeah, Lisa can definitely provide my contact information.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd be happy to do that. Bob Tedesco would like to make a comment.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. Wonderful, and thank you very much. I simply say, can I make a comment, because with my handicap, just typing a little bit took most of the time you spoke, so I couldn't do that. But I thought Donovan's question was wonderful, and I asked that it be addressed as soon as possible. And I would like to point out, most of my academic career was on Long Island and on delegations to many other countries. What is being experienced in Englewood and Bergen County school districts, and indeed New Jersey, that's also been happening on Long Island for many, many years, throughout New York State, and I can tell you in many of the states in this country, and as I found out, oddly enough, in Europe, which I was very shocked, but realizing it was stupid of me to be shocked, it was. So if you could ever do some international research, because I think there's a problem that goes beyond credulity. So, thank you, and wonderful talk.
Thank you. You are definitely right that this is not a problem that is unique to New Jersey. Systemic racism, bias, stereotypes based on race or national origin or sexual orientation, bullying between students in schools, none of this is unique to New Jersey. This happens around the country, and as you said, around the world. Humans seem to have an infinite capacity to label people as other when it is simply not true. I wanted to, if there are not other questions, or maybe even if they are, this seems like a good time, I just wanted to quote from Congressman John Lewis, who published in the New York Times an op-ed upon his death, calling for all people to come together and build what he calls a beloved community in which people lay down the burdens of division to demand respect for human dignity for all people. And our hope with the task force report, and really I think hopefully the hope of every person here, is to ensure a future in which the humanity of all people in our state, in our country, in our world is celebrated. Ray, I think you might have had a question.
Yeah, about, I don't know if that, it was in there about age bias, because I think more and more you see TV reports, news reports of somebody just coming along and sucker punching somebody, and it's a lot of times it's an older person. Is that on the rise? Is that considered something on the forefront?
So age discrimination, in terms of the number of bias incidents that are reported, it is a small number, but that does not mean that it's not happening. The bias incidents that are reported to local law enforcement are just that. They're things that are reported to local law enforcement as happening because of race or gender or sexual orientation. Age is actually not one of the categories in our state's hate crimes law. However, it is a protected category in employment. So if there is an example of someone, for example, being subjected to age-based harassment at work, that is something that violates the law against discrimination. We actually had a finding of probable cause last year, a woman who worked in a restaurant and who was subjected to persistent age-based harassment. Her boss would call her old lady persistently, even when she explained how offensive and hurtful that was. And we found probable cause to believe that the law against discrimination was violated there. So it definitely is an issue. It is not a protected characteristic, as I mentioned, in the hate crimes law, but it is in when it comes to employment discrimination.
Thank you.
All right. Does anyone, I don't want to end prematurely again, so I don't see any questions in the comment box. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? Okay. So Rachel, again, those were very great presentation, and I really appreciate you coming here. I know the whole club does. And again, this is just the beginning of a conversation, because we have to keep going. We've been having a lot of presentations, similar presentations, and we have to keep having the conversation over and over and over, and we've got to do more, and we've got to do better, and we have to get this right. So thank you for coming.